Let me begin. In 2016, Penn Museum, which is a part of the University of Pennsylvania, offered a 5-part publicly accessible course on science and race. Each session included a panel of scholarly experts, preceded by a workshop in which museum staff presented materials from the Samuel Morton collection of human crania. The collection includes more than 1,000 human skulls and served as evidence for Morton's claims about racial difference in his 19th century book, Crania Americana. Course materials for the last session in the Penn course included this disclaimer. In accordance with the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, passed by Congress in 1990, and out of respect for the beliefs of Native Americans regarding the bodies of their ancestors, the Penn Museum does not display or present images of any human remains from Native American people. This disclaimer was followed by images of crania specimens numbered 910, 916, and 917. The frontal bone of each bears a decades-old label that reads Negro, born in Africa. Penn Museum explains its decision to withhold Native remains from public view out of respect for the beliefs of Native Americans and to comply with NAGPRA, legislation that proponents justified, at least in part, with arguments about the religious and also universally human nature of Native burial customs. Since the law's passage in 1990, Native leaders have used NAGPRA to request the repatriation of human remains held by museums and laboratories. Hearings related to these requests often include references to religion. As scholar Greg Johnson has observed in his work on NAGPRA cases in Hawaii, Native Americans' religious references have unmatched power, and that's his quote, unmatched power to persuade authorities of their ancestral connections and ritual obligations to the dead. In contrast to Johnson's work, I'd like to consider 2 episodes of repatriation activism in which religion played a decidedly different role. The first involves Native student activists where I work at the University of Texas at Austin. In fall 2020, they mounted a public campaign calling for the return of 3 sets of Native American human remains to the members of the Miyakan Garza Band of Indians, a Quahaltecan group and state-recognized tribe who had made a NAGPRA request that the university denied. The second episode comes from the recent discovery of more African-American remains at Penn Museum, a story that prompted a series of protests last summer. And in these 2 examples of communities concerned about human remains, I argue, religion operated differently. Unlike the Native elders involved in NAGPRA cases over the last few decades, these activists, the student activists and the Black activists at Penn Museum, did not invoke religion to establish genealogical connection to a particular people or promote particular burial customs. In fact, they never said the word religion. But neither were their efforts couched in secular terms. Rather, advocates framed their activity as spiritual, insofar as they saw themselves connected to a wide variety of ancestors without reference to genetic or familial ties. They viewed their struggle as spiritual in that they enacted a range of ritual practices from their own community, but also from the communities of others. These choices suited what some scholars have called our current moment of return, as well as widespread Black Lives Matter activism in the wake of George Floyd's May 2020 killing by police. Native students at UT and Black protesters at Penn Museum situate their struggle over human remains within the wider effort to protect racialized bodies. With neither connection to religious institutions nor recognizably distinct religious traditions, these activists asserted the humanity of Black and Native bodies and peoples and the grievability of these remains that have long been subjected to state violence and scientific investigation. So, part 1, Austin, summer 2020. In the weeks following George Floyd's murder, members of the University of Texas football team joined the larger protest movement against police violence and called attention to their own experiences of racism on campus. As Division I athletes in football-focused Texas, their protest garnered significant attention, both in the state and, as this image from the New York Times shows, also outside of it. They demanded that UT donate funds to Black Lives Matter, that the school discontinue a song used at sports events with ties to an old-time minstrel show, and that the university recognize and uplift the history of Black athletics at UT. In the weeks that followed, student organizations across campus worked together to craft a more robust set of recommendations, which is now commonly referred to as the 8 demands. These included the removal of campus police officers from student neighborhoods, renaming campus buildings that had named after Confederate or segregationist leaders, and the adoption of a test optional admissions policy. The 8 demands were not limited to Black students' concerns. Demand number 3 called on UT to incorporate Native land acknowledgements in campus programming and materials. The university, the demand said, quote, does not own the land it is on. It went on to say members of the community need to know the land's Indigenous history, along with the non-Indigenous people's relationship to their historic dispossession. This attention to Native perspectives in the 8 demands resulted from the coalition that came together to make the list. More than 100 student organizations endorsed the demands. This broad support was quite significant, as UT's Native students have long expressed frustration at their low visibility on campus. Their experience in many ways mirrors the state of Texas's troubled history, with both marginalizing and erasing its Native presence. The 8 demands brought these previously unrecognized issues to the attention of other students and university administrators. As a result, students across campus reached out to the university's Native American and Indigenous Studies program. And in fall 2020, I happened to be serving as the interim director. So I kind of found myself in the middle of this. And I interacted with a variety of student groups who wanted to add land acknowledgements to their campus activities as a result of the 8 demands. Native students at UT seized on this moment to publicize another issue important to them: the presence of more than 1,000 human remains at UT's Archaeological Research Library, which is called TARL for short. They called particular attention to the 3 sets of remains at the center of a dispute between the university and the Miyakan Garza, who had requested repatriation under NAGPRA. As summer 2020 drew to a close, UT issued a statement rejecting the Miyakan Garza's request. Given that these were the heady days of successful organizing to create the 8 demands and the larger Black Lives movement around the country, Native students decided to press the issue. Working together with Miyakan Garza elders who live in the area, they raised awareness not only on UT's campus, but they even made the national news. Coverage of the Miyakan Garza case introduced many UT students to the presence of human remains on campus. Students received a quick education in the ways Native people have not been protected by common laws intended to shield bodies from desecration and theft. Instead, they learned US officials had long considered Native remains as, quote, resources. In 1868, for example, the Surgeon General ordered the collection of Native crania for medical study, resulting in a collection of more than 4,000 skulls at the Army Medical College Museum. In 1906, Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which defined Native remains on federal land as, quote, archaeological resources, and designated them as federal property. Scholars estimate that by the end of the 20th century, more than 2.5 million Native remains were in the possession of laboratories, museums, and other institutions across the United States. Part 2, Indian Country, 1967. In 1965, Suzanne Harjo, a Cheyenne and Muskogee Creek poet, sat down and wrote about the dream she had the night before. Here's the poem called Child of Time. A child of time, naked and weeping, walked one night in my dreamless sleep. She came She came to claim my word of honor, the promise she heard me make to keep. Her voice when she spoke was the sound of the wind, first howling, then moaning and sighing, a sound of a storm without end. She knew of my early morning visit to the Museum of Indian Dead, where I had stared at her small torn gown of leather and beads, all stained with red blood, should mean something more than this. Blood flows and lives and gives again, but here, only dead rust patterns surrounding a bullet hole where her belly had been. To most, it was merely a dress on display, placed next to the ancient Navajo loom, lighted and indexed for all the curious patrons of this bone-chilling public tomb. This dress of dried blood does not belong here. It should be saged and secretly burned. And now, with the dawn, her voice on the wind, I'll walk this way till my spirits returned. Hush now, my pretty, there's work to be done. Sleep on the earth, I'll give your heart ease. Your name will be claimed. Now quiet the storm and come to me next as a soft, gentle breeze. Harjo, in the years after writing this poem and having this experience in a dream, helped gather a pan-Indian coalition of those with shared concerns about the number of human remains and sacred objects housed and sometimes displayed at museums in the United States. In 1967, they organized a meeting at Bear Butte, an important site to many Northern Plains Indian nations. They developed a plan to lobby for the repatriation of remains and objects, as well as the reform of museum practices. They also imagined the possibility of a new museum on the National Mall. As Harjo later observed, it started with a vision in a sacred place. Harjo's articulation in a religious register anticipated the discourse of many Native activists involved in the repatriation effort. Quote, "We consecrated the plan for the museum on sacred ground, so it was as good as done, and it was left to those of us who were young and strong to carry it out," end quote. In collaboration with elected officials and other allies, Native activists achieved several of their goals. In 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act protected forms of ritual practice, sacred objects, and access to sacred sites. It did not, however, refer to human remains. Native advocates kept pressing. In 1989, Congress passed the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which designated a new museum on the National Mall and mandated repatriation of human remains held by the Smithsonian Institution. In 1990, Congress passed NAGPRA, extending the repatriation mandate to all institutions in the United States receiving federal funds. Throughout this process, advocates rejected any suggestion that human remains were resources or that their respectful treatment was possible at all in museum or laboratory settings. They insisted that grave disturbance, skeletal collection, museum relocation, and scientific investigation were affronts to Native people's basic humanity. In particular, such collections disrupted the quintessentially human and sacred act of burying the dead. The irony here is that the institutions for the study of human cultures are the largest holders of Native American human remains. This is due to the history of early anthropology. The first anthropologists pointed to the ubiquity of regard for the dead, along with death rituals, as evidence of a religious impulse common to all of humanity. At the same time they made these arguments, they were disagreeing with many Europeans and Euro-Americans who had a lot of stereotypes and held to these stereotypes that Native people actually disregarded and mistreated their own dead. But even as these early anthropologists and theorizers of religion pointed to widespread human belief in the immortality of the soul and had ritual treatment for those who were deceased, they also posited distinct differences between how societies interacted with the dead. On the one hand, they argued, civilized people respected the dead. On the other, as anthropologist James Fraser put it, primitive peoples feared the dead. This was one argument within a broader theory of human evolution that put Western civilized peoples at the top and so-called primitives, including Native Americans, at the bottom. To study the stages of human development, these early anthropologists looked for evidence in primitive societies that had actually persisted into the present. This included Aboriginal groups in Australia or Native groups in the Americas. They conducted observational research among these communities, and they also collected their remains as resources for study. So when Native activists started advocating to repatriate remains and reform museums in the late 1960s, they faced institutions that had long claimed to respect Native people's basic humanity and the importance of deathways in Native communities. It's foundational research for early anthropology. However, these institutions prized scientific research over concerns of Native descendants that they truly did not take seriously. They placed the work of the civilized over the superstitious notions of the uncivilized. NAGPRA, however, seemed to level the playing field between the scientists and the Native advocates. Admissible evidence in NAGPRA cases includes scientific arguments about the importance of research and tribal perspectives on proper disposition of ancestral remains. Speaking in a religious register has proved enormously effective as Native advocates have made these claims. And the same was true when the Miacon Garza case played out in Texas over last year. So let's come back to Texas for part 3, Texas 2011. That summer, construction workers on the campus of Texas State University, which is just south of Austin, found the skeletal remains of a young man buried approximately 1,200 years ago. Forensic anthropologists at the university took custody of the remains. Leaders of the Miacon Garza, who lived nearby, requested repatriation of the remains under NAGPRA. NAGPRA legislation demands that petitioners establish what's called cultural affinity, or proof that the remains are linked to particular tribal nations. Scientists scrutinize these assertions of connection to eliminate the possibility of misidentification. But the requirement has also allowed institutions to retain the majority of their collections, which scientists deem unidentifiable, that they simply cannot, with confidence, connect them to tribal nations in the present day. Soon after NAGPRA was passed, Native activists noted this problem, and after years of advocacy, convinced Congress to amend the law. In 2010, a revision required institutions to, quote, initiate consultation with tribes from whose ancestral lands, as yet unidentified remains, had been removed. Or as one scholar observed, this new ruling, quote, leaves little doubt that the Secretary of the Interior views the purpose of NAGPRA legislation as the return of the native dead to Native peoples. So basically any unidentified remains, museums were now mandated to at least start the consultation process with any Native group who were in those territories where they were found. In 2016, Texas State University and the Miacon Garza came to an agreement. The university gave the remains to the tribe for reburial, and one of the reburials they did is pictured here on the right. The Miacon Garza's request for 3 sets of remains held by the University of Texas, however, has been consistently denied, despite the new rule on the need to repatriate what have been considered culturally unidentifiable remains. UT officials argued that they were not convinced the Miacon Garza were culturally affiliated to remains in their collection, despite them being found in territories with a historic Miacon Garza presence. In response, the elders and their allies staged various forms of public protest throughout late summer and fall 2020. And religion proved to be an important aspect of their public acts. As Greg Johnson has observed of earlier NAGPRA disputes, religious rhetoric allows elders to speak in a posture of, quote, moral certitude, making, quote, epistemological claims authoritatively and non-falsifiably. When faced with non-native scientists who emphasize the importance of laboratory research, religious rhetoric provides a sort of moral force to elders' presentations. And in the case of establishing cultural affinity, religion has great potential to overcome the ruptures that settler occupation created between past tradition and present-day tribal nations. And for most listeners, as Greg Johnson has observed, this religious discourse by elders is also profoundly moving. Religious language about the continuity of deathways positions collecting institutions like UT as disruptors of an otherwise orderly process, one that has, even though taking place far in the past, has significant effects in the present. As one Miakan Garza elder stated, and he's pictured here, we believe that when a person is buried, they depart on their spiritual journey. When they are unearthed, their spiritual journey is interrupted. It is our obligation as Indigenous people to return our ancestors to Mother Earth so they can proceed to the great mystery of the cosmos. Speakers assert cultural continuity between past and present, or as another elder involved in protests around the case claimed at a teach-in about the situation, quote, "It is universally understood that our communities have the right to send us on to the next world at the time of our death," right? So the language collapses past and present. Kinship terms also operate especially powerfully to collapse the distance between past and present. When interviewed about her role in a repatriation ceremony, one elder remarked, "I said today, we have here our sister. And when I said the word sister, I felt so choked up because this was my sister, actually was my sister, my ancestor." Ritual performance is another way Native elders support their arguments for cultural affinity or cultural affiliation. But this can be tricky as settler disruption makes ritual continuity nearly impossible. Oral traditions offer glimpses of past practice, but the details aren't known in their fullness. Traditional sites for burial are now in settler hands, so new places must also be designated. Native elders, therefore, whoops, I went ahead one, sorry. Native elders, therefore, use spoken and sung words and ritual objects to connect their need for a new need for reburial to a projected sense of past practice. For instance, in a video of a repatriation ceremony, a Miakan Garza elder held up a piece of red cloth in which a set of remains were wrapped. She placed them in a newly made grave. She offered prayers in Kwahaltecan. She held up a pail of water, praying and pouring it over these newly interred remains. Those around her shoveled in new dirt and sprinkled flower petals. She emphasized that their new burial site was near one of the sacred springs that the tribal nation has always had a close relationship to. So despite having a new site, new actors, and perhaps even new ritual details, the acting out of ritual links them, at least in some way, to ancestral past, even if they are not precise replicas of either places or objects or even words that would have been used in the past. Having employed religious discourse in their efforts to claim cultural affinity, Miakan Garza elders also wield this language in a mode scholar Greg Johnson has also observed in cases in Hawaii. This kind of speech lends to the situation's moral gravity. These presentations are meant to persuade listeners, especially non-Native listeners, of the Native community's need to repatriate remains and how it outweighs the academic interests of the scientific community. For instance, during fall 2020, the Miakan Garza elders opened protest events and teach-ins with prayers in the Kwahaltecan language. They accompanied sung prayers with traditional rattles. They invited participants to stand and observe these prayers in respectful silence. Here, elders capitalized on the continuities they had established and called on listeners to respond. Quote, "We are now sending a plea to all people of good conscience. Help us rebury our ancestors." This discourse, as Johnson observed earlier and as I witnessed in the fall of 2020, has, quote, "tremendous moral gravity," and offers listeners a moral invitation to participate in the healing accomplished by repatriation. It also allows a minority community to assert their basic humanity, a humanity clearly displayed by their religious traditions for dealing with the dead. But to return to my opening comparison and reference to Penn Museum, why is there a process by which Native advocates, especially those who speak in a religious register, can successfully reclaim their dead, while the crania of the enslaved remain on display. Or to borrow feminist scholar Judith Butler's question, why must Native advocates run this particular gauntlet to make their ancestors grievable? And other groups, in the case of Penn Museum, descendants of African Americans, must go through a different process. What if Native leaders simply refused to provide the kind of proof that NAGPRA proceedings require? What if, as many UT students asserted in the fall of 2020, these remains were grievable and therefore requiring repatriation simply because they were human, simply because they had been uprooted from where their kin had lovingly placed them? So those are the set of questions I bring to part 4, which returns us to Austin in the fall of 2020. Native advocates and allies do not rely on religious discourse alone. They also talk about NAGPRA as a piece of human rights legislation. This alternate framing can be useful when advocates confront some of the problems that come with religious discourse. For instance, scholars have observed that religion is a modern and ill-fitting category in many Native societies whose languages have no meaningful translation for the term. Others point to the problem of identifying traditional Indian religion, which often means a calcified notion of what Native people practiced in the 18th or 19th centuries. And more broadly, as Winifred Sullivan has argued, ritual practices surrounding death vary widely, even within more legible traditions like Christianity or Judaism. And they range from the authorized and required to the improvised and the occasional. But it's also true that some Native advocates are simply less comfortable with religious discourse. I observed this especially among UT students involved in the main Native American student group on campus, the Native American and Indigenous Collective. These are mostly students with Indigenous backgrounds who are either first generation here in Texas or are immigrants themselves from Latin America, or are actually Latin American and are studying abroad at UT. These students, unlike the Miyakan Garza elders they collaborated with, were much more likely to reference human rights. And because they lived their lives as students, they also framed the dispute as an issue of campus diversity and equality. They connected the presence of remains on campus to broader concerns about state violence, articulated by groups like Black Lives Matter. My question was whether or not their discourse would have the same power to move listeners. Would they be successful without what Johnson called the unmatched power provided by more traditional religious discourse? Native students at UT rallied around the Miyakan Garza elders in a number of ways. They gave interviews to student journalists, circulated petitions, generated social media, here's one example, and met with the university's interim president. In that meeting, they recounted experiences of racism on campus, their frustration at the meager resources allotted to Native students, and concerns that the university failed to promote Native studies and recruit and retain Native faculty. This framing aligned with the sentiments expressed in the 8 demands, which called for a, quote, multifaceted approach to conversations about race. The Native student advocates also engaged broader justice-seeking movements. They frequently referenced struggles in other minoritized communities. For instance, during a teach-in at the Archaeological Research Lab at UT, one student called on UT's president to remember what he had said in a June 2020 statement about George Floyd. In it, President Hartzell had said, quote, "We must continue our struggle for meaningful and enduring change to overcome acts of racism and violence that corrode our community." The student speaker suggested that returning the remains to the Miyakan Garza would be one tangible way the university could live out this call for change made by its own president. The connections to broader justice movements were not merely rhetorical. Native students persuaded their non-Native peers to protest the university's denial of the Miyakan Garza. A diverse array of students signed letters and petitions, building on the organizational momentum achieved during the writing of the 8 demands. A significant number of non-Native students attended events, such as a teach-in, to express their solidarity. Native students also connected with their non-Native peers in ways that they hoped would teach them about Indigenous histories and experiences by using language that emphasized their common humanity, but also their common experience of racist dehumanization. Speaking of the remains at UT, one student proclaimed, "These could be anybody's ancestors." In this way, Native student activists wanted justice for Native remains kept in labs and for Black victims of police violence. And so you'll see the piece of social media on the right to the screen, but it could be followed in the feed of these students with something related to Black Lives Matter. We might ask then if students focus on human rights and intersectional solidarity instead of religious discourse lessened their impact. I hesitate to say no, as I saw instead a different kind of impact, a different kind of moral power. This was partly because students employed religious discourse in some ways. Most notably, they participated in forms of ceremony as part of their protest. At the teach-in, for instance, they created an altar and wielded ceremonial objects as they made offerings during the protest. A student group at the protest performed Aztec dances, wearing elaborate traditional regalia. And here they are dancing right in front of the sign of the research campus where the laboratory is. They displayed a kind of pan-Indigenous spiritual sensibility, which included traditions that some of them would have practiced in their home countries, or at least were based in their home countries, but also included prayers in Cuautlatecan that they had learned from the local Miacan Garza elders. So it was kind of a spiritual mishmash. As has been observed in some NAGPRA cases, using Native language and forms of ritual establishes speakers as authoritative. It also suggests continuity between past traditions and present-day communities, strengthening tribes' claims to cultural affinity. Such performances by students also established their authority, I argue, but in a different way. For them, it signaled their identity as Native people, as Native students, in a world and a university that seems to them hostile to their presence. They showed themselves to be partners in a pan-Indigenous coalition open to a wide variety of ceremonial experiences. Further, the students' version of religious discourse, framed within their search for equity in universities and alongside broader movements for racial justice, offered a different kind of moral critique and invitation. According to Greg Johnson, religious discourse in NAGPRA hearings allows elders to speak with strength from their minority position. For the Miacan Garza elders, it functions to call on non-Native people, imploring them to support the small tribe's need to care for the Cuautlatecan dead. The Native UT students, in contrast, spoke from a minority position as students of color, mostly to other UT students of color. They highlighted a shared desire for their inclusion in the university and for their bodily integrity. And so, to answer my own question, yes, the students dancing, speaking, and making offerings worked. It operated in a different sort of religious register, to be sure, but it was still quite, at least to me. Last part, back to Philadelphia. Penn Museum and its 2016 course on race and science changed, at least its public presentation changed after May 2020. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and the protests that followed, the museum made several changes in relation to the Morton collection. And I just want to highlight some of their statements here. And remember, this was related to a set of classes and also displays at the museum of human crania, including crania from formerly enslaved people. And so they wrote on their website in 2020, Penn Museum and the University of Pennsylvania apologized for the unethical possession of human remains in the Morton collection. It is time for these individuals to be returned to their ancestral communities wherever possible as a step toward atonement and repair. And then the other two sections of text talk about their process for doing that. It basically says they are going to relocate these remains so that none are on display, and that they're creating a community advisory group to go through the process of repatriation. But the museum's connection to African and African American remains was not limited to Samuel Morton's collection from the 19th century. In spring 2021, news broke about the remains of 2 children kept at the museum who had been killed in the 1985 police bombing of Move, a small religious community of Black political revolutionaries, right? And there's a group photo from some of the members in 1978, and then an image on the right, which is after the result of the firebombing of their particular row house, which led to a fire that burned down dozens of homes. The city's coroner initially transferred the remains of these 2 children to a Penn medical anthropologist. He identified them as Tree and Delisha Africa, children who lived in the Move row home along with their mother. Instead of giving the identified remains to the next of kin, the anthropologist kept them in his lab. When he later moved to Princeton University, he took the remains with them. And while there, he allowed them to be featured in an educational video about forensic investigation. All of this without any permissions given by family members. Princeton eventually sent the remains back to Penn Museum, where they sat in boxes for many years. Black Philadelphians responded quickly to this news story in spring 2021. The Move bombing is still an open wound for many in West Philadelphia. And the news came just before the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder. Protesters gathered at the museum. They criticized ongoing state violence and the history of medical experimentation on Black bodies. To me, this seemed like another opportunity for solidarity, but the process for reclaiming the Move members' bodies is fundamentally different. NAGPRA applies only to Native Americans. Despite the Move members' kinship with the 2 girls, their shared residence, and their shared religious commitments, surviving members of Move cannot reclaim Tree and Delisha Africa. I wondered then how NAGPRA, oh, apologies, my dog just burst into the room, I'm sorry. I wondered then how NAGPRA and religion's centrality to Native people trying to use it not only work differently for older and younger Native activists, which I had witnessed at UT, but also how it potentially closes off options for minoritized groups to work together. This despite the ways that Black protesters at Penn echoed the words of Native students at UT, quote, "We are not subjects of study, we are human beings." The broader movement for Black lives, which has focused on police violence, has also occasioned a number of conversations about African-American remains. As recently documented in a New Yorker article by Jill Lepore, Black activists around the country are trying to preserve Black cemeteries. A bill described as an African-American NAGPRA is in the works in Congress. But if the bill is passed, it will raise equally thorny questions. Who should take custody of and care for these remains? Some, including Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates, says genetic testing is the answer. It will link remains to to descendants in the present. It will overcome slavery's erasure of family ties. But local Black activists who live near these cemeteries tend to disagree. They say they don't need a genetic link. Instead, their proximity, their common experience of being Black people in these same difficult places makes them the rightful caretaker of these remains. So once again, we have a debate over who should care for the dead, for remains that have been disturbed and abused. Just as NAGPRA offered a path forward, new plans, I think, are going to emerge in the coming years. And because ritual is a central element to human communities' encounters with the dead, I'm pretty sure religion is going to continue to be part of the conversation. But from what I saw among young activists and also at places like Penn Museum, I think the way that we will talk about religion and how religion is framed in these debates is going to change. Thank you.